He was conducting a routine glacier study and didn't expect anything unusual, but strange sounds began coming from a massive hole beneath the ice, and when the team went down inside, they saw something no one was prepared for. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The expedition began far from any familiar notion of civilization, in a place where maps grew vague and satellite images offered more questions than answers. Deep within the Antarctic interior, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest permanent research station, a vast and ancient glacier stretched across the horizon like a frozen ocean locked in time. This was not a region visited often, even by seasoned polar scientists. Its remoteness was precisely the reason it had been chosen. The official purpose of the mission was framed in cautious, technical language. The team had been assembled to assess the long-term stability of one of Antarctica's oldest inland glaciers, a massive body of ice whose lower layers had formed long before modern humans ever imagined the southern continent. Recent satellite observations had revealed subtle but persistent anomalies in this sector. Irregular surface depressions, unexpected variations in ice density, and unusual radar reflections that suggested complex internal structures beneath the frozen surface. While none of these findings alone were unprecedented, their convergence in such a limited area had raised concern among glaciologists and climate researchers alike. In practical terms, the expedition was tasked with determining whether these anomalies represented a growing structural risk. If the glacier contained extensive internal voids or unstable zones, it could pose a threat to future research infrastructure, airborne supply routes, and even global sea level models. Antarctic ice, after all, was not a static monument but a dynamic system, constantly shifting under its own immense weight. Understanding its hidden weaknesses was essential, even if doing so meant venturing into areas that had remained untouched for centuries. Beyond the formal objectives outlined in the mission brief, there were additional scientific interests quietly motivating the team. The glacier's depth and age made it an ideal candidate for extracting pristine ice cores that could preserve a detailed record of Earth's climatic past. Trapped air bubbles, layers of volcanic ash, microscopic organic material, and ancient aerosols were all locked within the ice, waiting to be studied. Such samples could refine existing climate models and offer insight into environmental conditions from thousands of years ago, long before industrial influence reshaped the planet's atmosphere. The expedition team itself reflected the mission's complexity. It was composed of specialists selected not only for their technical expertise, but also for their ability to endure prolonged isolation and extreme conditions. The team leader was a veteran polar researcher, known for balancing caution with decisiveness. Years spent navigating unstable ice shelves and coordinating emergency evacuations had taught them how quickly conditions could deteriorate in Antarctica, and how important it was to act before uncertainty became danger. Alongside the leader were glaciologists whose careers had been devoted to understanding the behavior of ice at both macroscopic and microscopic scales. They could read the glacier's surface the way others read terrain, recognizing subtle patterns that hinted at stress, movement, and hidden fractures below. Their experience would prove critical in interpreting what the satellite data could not fully explain. A geophysicist specializing in acoustic and vibrational analysis rounded out the core scientific group. Equipped with sensitive instruments designed to detect low-frequency signals through dense ice, this researcher was responsible for mapping subsurface structures indirectly, using sound and vibration rather than direct observation. In environments where drilling was impractical or dangerous, Such methods often provided the first clues about what lay beneath. The team also included an engineer trained in rescue operations and rope systems for extreme cold environments. Their presence was not merely precautionary. In Antarctica, even routine fieldwork carried inherent risk, and the possibility of encountering unstable ice formations meant that vertical access techniques might become necessary. The engineers' expertise ensured that if the glacier revealed something unexpected, the team would be prepared to respond safely. Completing the group was a biologist with experience studying polar ecosystems and microbial life in extreme environments. Although Antarctica was often imagined as lifeless, its ice concealed complex biological histories. From ancient microorganisms preserved in frozen layers to modern species adapted to the continent's margins, any unusual discovery would require careful handling to avoid contamination or loss of scientific value. The biologist's role was to ensure that living organisms or biological remains, if encountered, were documented and preserved according to strict protocols. Daily life during the expedition quickly became defined by isolation and routine. The camp was established on a broad expanse of wind-packed snow, chosen for its relative stability and distance from visible crevasses. From this temporary base, the team conducted surveys across a wide radius, hauling equipment on sleds and monitoring weather conditions with constant vigilance. Temperatures regularly plunged far below what most humans ever experienced, and the air was so dry and cold that exposed skin numbed within seconds. The environment exerted a subtle psychological pressure as well. The Antarctic silence was unlike any other. There were no insects, no distant animal calls, no rustling vegetation. Wind, when it came, arrived with sudden force, scouring the ice and filling the air with a low, constant roar. When it subsided, the stillness that followed felt almost unnatural, amplifying every footstep and mechanical sound. In such conditions, even seasoned researchers found themselves hyper-aware of their surroundings, attuned to details they might have ignored elsewhere. It was during one of these routine survey days that the first signs of something unusual emerged. As part of their standard procedure, the team deployed a series of instruments designed to measure ice density, internal stress, and vibrational activity. These devices were typically used to detect natural ice movement, minor shifts caused by temperature changes or internal pressure redistribution. What they recorded instead was something far less predictable. At irregular intervals, the sensors picked up faint but distinct low-frequency signals. At first, the data appeared inconclusive. Antarctica was full of strange noises produced by shifting ice, thermal contraction, and distant calving events. However, as the geophysicist analyzed the recordings more closely, a pattern began to emerge. The signals were repeating, not randomly, but with a loose rhythm that did not correspond to known glacial processes. The team initially assumed equipment malfunction. Instruments were recalibrated, repositioned, and tested under controlled conditions. Yet the signals persisted, appearing again and again, always originating from the same general area of the glacier. More intriguingly, they seemed to emanate from below the surface rather than across it, as if something deep within the ice was resonating upward. At the same time, the glaciologists began to notice subtle physical irregularities in the same region. The snow cover appeared thinner, and the surface exhibited slight depressions that did not match typical accumulation patterns. When they walked across the area, the sound beneath their boots changed, producing a hollow quality that suggested empty space somewhere below. It was not enough to indicate immediate danger, but it was unusual enough to warrant attention. As the days passed, these anomalies became impossible to ignore. The acoustic signals grew clearer in the data logs, and their consistency challenged every conventional explanation the team proposed. The glacier, it seemed, was concealing something within its depths, something that standard models could not fully account for. By the end of the first week, the expedition's focus had shifted. What began as a broad environmental survey was narrowing toward a specific mystery embedded deep in the ice. The team documented every observation meticulously, aware that whatever they were approaching lay beyond routine scientific exploration. The glacier was no longer just a subject of study. It had become a question, one that demanded to be answered, even if doing so meant confronting the unknown beneath Antarctica's ancient, frozen surface. As the instruments continued their quiet work and the wind swept endlessly across the wide expanse, the team prepared to follow the signals to their source. None of them yet understood the true nature of what awaited them, only that the glacier was no longer silent, and that its hidden depths were calling for closer examination. The glacier had ceased to be a passive object of observation. After the first week, it had begun to impose its presence on the expedition, quietly but persistently demanding attention. The faint signals detected during the initial surveys no longer felt incidental. They lingered in the minds of the researchers even when the instruments were powered down, as if the ice itself had introduced a question that could not be set aside. Following the observations of the previous days, the team expanded their acoustic monitoring network. What had started as routine data collection now became a focused effort to understand the origin of the strange signals. Additional sensors were deployed in widening arcs around the suspected source area, carefully positioned at varying distances and depths beneath the snow. Each placement was calculated to eliminate surface interference and isolate vibrations traveling through the dense ice below. The work was slow and methodical. Every step across the glacier required caution, and each instrument had to be secured against wind, cold, and shifting ice. As the network grew, so did the clarity of the recordings. When the geophysicist compiled the first synchronized dataset, the pattern was unmistakable. The signals were real, repeatable, and localized. They were not constant. Instead, they arrived in irregular cycles, sometimes separated by long periods of silence. When they did occur, they lasted only seconds, fading as abruptly as they began. The frequencies were low, at the edge of human hearing, but the waveforms showed complexity. These were not the sharp cracks associated with ice fracturing, nor the deep rumbles typical of distant glacial movement. The signals carried a pulsing quality, as though the ice were briefly amplifying something originating far below. Attempts were made to correlate the sounds with environmental factors. Temperature fluctuations were logged with precision. Wind speed and direction were monitored continuously. Atmospheric pressure changes were tracked and compared against the signal timeline. None of it matched. The sounds appeared during calm conditions as often as during storms, at stable temperatures as well as during gradual warming or cooling cycles. Whatever their source, it was not responding to surface weather. The depth estimates added another layer of intrigue. By comparing the slight delays between sensors, the team calculated that the signals were originating from far beneath the glacier's surface, well below the upper layers affected by seasonal change. The ice at that depth was old, compressed, and typically silent. Sound did travel through ice efficiently, but the structure required to produce such signals from below was difficult to explain. As the data accumulated, the team began the process of elimination. Equipment failure was ruled out through repeated calibration checks and cross-validation between independent devices. Known glacial phenomena were considered in detail. Ice quakes, which could produce brief acoustic events, usually followed identifiable stress patterns and occurred in clusters. These signals did not. Subglacial water movement was another possibility, but water beneath inland Antarctic glaciers was typically trapped in stable channels, producing continuous noise rather than intermittent pulses. The more hypotheses were discarded, the narrower the remaining explanations became. One possibility, cautiously discussed, was the presence of a large internal void or system of cavities within the glacier. Such spaces could act as resonant chambers, amplifying even minor disturbances into detectable signals. But this raised another question. What disturbance was triggering them? As the scientists debated, the glaciologists conducted detailed surface inspections of the suspected area. The subtle depressions noted earlier appeared more significant when mapped carefully. Snow accumulation patterns suggested that the surface above the signal source behaved differently than the surrounding ice. In some places, the snowpack was thinner, and in others, faint linear features hinted at stress beneath the surface. When the team tested the ice by sound, striking it gently with tools, the response was noticeably hollow. This discovery shifted the tone of the expedition. What had begun as curiosity now carried an undercurrent of risk. Hollow ice in Antarctica was never something to dismiss lightly. A concealed cavity could collapse without warning, swallowing equipment or people in seconds. The team adjusted their movement protocols immediately, spacing themselves further apart and marking suspected weak zones with visible flags. At the same time, the acoustic signals began to change. While their frequency remained low, some recordings captured subtle variations that resembled modulation rather than simple resonance. The pulses were no longer uniform. In a few instances, the sensors detected clusters of shorter signals grouped together, followed by longer silence. It was enough to unsettle even the most experienced members of the team. Late one evening, as data was reviewed inside the insulated shelter, the geophysicist noted something that had been overlooked. When the raw recordings were slowed and filtered, the signal patterns exhibited irregular intervals that defied purely mechanical explanation. They were not rhythmic enough to suggest machinery or repetitive physical stress, yet they were too structured to be random. The observation was met with silence. No one was prepared to label the signals as anything more than unexplained, but the implication was clear. The glacier was not merely shifting. Something within it was interacting with its environment. Despite the growing uncertainty, the team remained committed to scientific discipline. They documented every anomaly without speculation, aware that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. Still, the atmosphere in the camp subtly shifted. Conversations grew quieter. Equipment checks became more frequent. Each member of the team felt the weight of isolation more acutely, as though the vast white emptiness surrounding them had drawn closer. The decision to investigate the source directly did not come all at once. It emerged gradually, through careful assessment rather than impulse. The signals were too consistent to ignore, and the surface indicators suggested a structural anomaly of significant size. Avoiding the area entirely would leave the mission incomplete and the data unresolved. The team leader, after reviewing all findings, authorized a controlled approach towards the signal's apparent origin. Preparations were made with heightened caution. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed at short range, scanning the ice beneath their feet. The images were fragmented, distorted by depth and density, but they confirmed what the acoustic data implied. There was empty space below, far larger than a typical crevasse. The void extended downward, its boundaries irregular and undefined. As the team advanced, the sounds became audible without instruments. At first, they were barely perceptible, a faint vibration more felt than heard. Then, during a moment of absolute calm, a soft echo rose from beneath the ice. It was distant, weak, and fleeting, but unmistakable. Several team members stopped instinctively, listening in silence as the sound faded back into the glacier. The moment marked a turning point. Whatever lay beneath the ice was no longer an abstract data point. It was present, hidden just out of sight, separated from them by a thinning barrier of ancient ice. The team stood at the threshold between observation and direct confrontation with the unknown. By the time the source area was fully mapped, there was no longer any doubt that the glacier concealed a massive internal feature. The signals, the hollow surface, and the radar data converged into a single conclusion. Somewhere beneath their feet, the ice had opened into a space that should not have existed so close to the surface. As daylight stretched endlessly across the frozen landscape, the team prepared to take the next step. They would move closer, carefully and deliberately, toward the heart of the anomaly. The glacier had revealed its voice. Now it was leading them toward the opening from which the strange signals emerged, an opening that would soon change the course of the expedition forever. The approach toward the heart of the anomaly was carried out with a level of caution that bordered on ritual. After the confirmation that a vast internal void lay beneath the glacier's surface, every movement across the ice took on new significance. The team advanced slowly, spreading their weight, testing each step, listening not only to their instruments, but to the subtle feedback of the glacier itself. The ice no longer felt uniform. In places, it responded with a dull, hollow resonance that lingered in the air for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. The first visible sign appeared almost by accident. What initially looked like an ordinary snow depression revealed itself, upon closer inspection, as something far more serious. The snow surface sagged inward in a near-perfect oval, its edges marked by faint fractures radiating outward like frozen veins. The depression was shallow at first glance, but as the wind swept loose snow aside, a darker void became visible beneath the thin crust. The team halted immediately. Markers were placed around the area, and no one approached the center without being secured by a safety line. As more snow was carefully cleared away, the true nature of the formation emerged. Beneath the fragile surface layer was a vertical opening, plunging straight down into darkness. The hole was not narrow like a typical crevasse, nor jagged from recent fracturing. Its edges were smooth, worn by time, and its shape suggested long-term formation rather than sudden collapse. Cold air flowed steadily upward from the opening, carrying with it a sharp, metallic chill that felt different from the surrounding atmosphere. It was as if the glacier itself were exhaling. Along with the cold came the sound. Now, unobstructed by layers of ice and snow, the strange signals rose faintly from below. They were clearer than before, echoing softly against the smooth ice walls, no longer confined to abstract data on a screen. The team leader ordered everyone to maintain distance while the opening was assessed. Using a laser rangefinder, they measured the visible diameter, which exceeded anything they had anticipated. The hole was massive, wide enough that its edges disappeared into shadow when viewed from above. Attempts to gauge its depth revealed only darkness. The beam of light extended downward for dozens of meters before fading, unable to reach the bottom. This was no ordinary glacial feature. Typical moulins or melt shafts formed through the surface melting and seasonal water flow, but this glacier lay far inland, where temperatures rarely approached the melting point. The formation of such a deep, open shaft here challenged existing understanding of Antarctic ice dynamics. As the glaciologists examined the walls of the opening, they noted distinct layers within the ice, each representing a different era of snowfall, compression, and atmospheric history. Darker bands of dust and volcanic ash traced ancient climatic events frozen in place. Some layers were warped or curved inward, suggesting prolonged interaction with heat or water at various points in the glacier's past. These features indicated that the whole was not a recent development. It had been forming, slowly and silently, for centuries. Closer inspection revealed additional details that deepened the mystery. Portions of the ice walls appeared polished, almost glass-like, as though water had once flowed along them repeatedly. In other places, elongated ice formations clung to the sides of the shaft, resembling frozen stalactites formed by dripping meltwater that had long since vanished. These structures spoke of cycles of melting and refreezing that did not fit neatly into current models of the region's climate history. The presence of such features suggested that heat, however limited or intermittent, had once penetrated this part of the glacier. Whether from geothermal sources, trapped subglacial water, or some other process, it was clear that the ice here had experienced a complex and prolonged evolution. The whole was not merely a structural weakness. It was a record of dynamic processes hidden deep within Antarctica's frozen interior. As the team continued their examination, they became aware of a subtle instability around the opening. Small fragments of ice occasionally broke free from the upper edges and fell into the darkness below, their impacts lost to silence before any sound could return. This reinforced the need for extreme caution. A collapse of the rim could occur without warning, especially under the combined weight of people and equipment. Despite the risks, the scientific value of the discovery was undeniable. Direct access to such depths offered a rare opportunity to study the glacier's internal structure without extensive drilling. Samples could be taken from layers that were otherwise inaccessible, and the internal environment could be measured directly. For glaciology, geology, and climate science alike, the whole represented an unprecedented window into the past. The team debated the implications quietly, fully aware that standing at the edge of the opening marked a transition point in the expedition. They were no longer simply observers on the glacier's surface. They were now confronted with a direct path into its hidden interior. As the light shifted subtly across the ice, the strange sounds grew more pronounced. At irregular intervals, faint echoes drifted upward, no longer masked by layers of snow. The acoustic specialist recorded these moments carefully, noting changes in intensity and clarity. The sounds seemed to originate far below, from somewhere beyond the visible reach of their lights. Their source remained unknown, but their persistence suggested that whatever produced them was still active. The biologist, observing the airflow rising from the shaft, noted that the temperature within the hole appeared slightly more stable than at the surface. This hinted at a microenvironment insulated from external fluctuations, a possibility that carried profound implications. If the conditions below were less hostile than the surface, it raised the question of whether life, even briefly, could persist within such a space. This possibility added a new dimension to the expedition's purpose. The mission was no longer limited to assessing structural risk or extracting climate data. There was now the chance of encountering biological evidence preserved in an environment that had remained isolated for centuries. The team understood the importance of proceeding methodically, ensuring that any discovery was documented and preserved according to strict scientific protocols. As evening approached, the decision was made to suspend further action until a full plan could be developed. The hole was marked clearly, and safety perimeters were established to prevent accidental approach during low visibility. From a distance, the opening appeared almost unreal, a dark wound in the otherwise pristine expanse of ice. Back at camp, the team reviewed their findings in detail. Data from acoustic sensors, radar scans, and visual observations were combined to create the first coherent model of the structure beneath the glacier. The conclusion was unavoidable. The hole extended far deeper than initially estimated, leading into a complex system of internal spaces rather than terminating at a simple cavity. This realization brought both excitement and apprehension. Exploring such a system would require specialized equipment, careful planning, and an acceptance of significant risk. Yet the alternative, leaving the anomaly unexplored, was equally troubling. The signals continued. The glacier remained active, its internal processes ongoing and unresolved. As night settled into the endless Antarctic twilight, the team prepared for the next phase of the expedition. They would need to descend into the hole itself, to follow the path that the glacier had opened over centuries. Whatever lay below, it was now clear that the anomaly was not incidental. It was a gateway, leading into a hidden world beneath the ice, one that demanded direct exploration. The transition from surface study to vertical descent marked a profound shift in the expedition's character. The glacier, once a vast and silent presence beneath their feet, had revealed an entrance into its depths. And with that revelation came the understanding that the answers they sought could only be found by venturing downward, into the cold and darkness where the strange sounds were born. The discovery of the vast opening in the glacier changed the rhythm of the expedition completely. What had once been a forward-moving survey across the ice now turned inward, focusing on a single, ominous point that seemed to draw all attention toward itself. The hole was no longer just a feature on a map or a curiosity recorded in data logs. It had become the central axis around which every decision now revolved. The team understood that descending into the glacier was not an impulsive choice, but a commitment that required absolute preparation. Antarctica offered no margin for error, and a vertical descent into an ancient ice formation magnified every existing risk. Before any rope was anchored or any person approached the edge, the team devoted an entire cycle of daylight to analysis, calculation, and planning. The first priority was safety. Using all available data, the glaciologists and engineer worked together to assess the structural integrity of the opening. Ground-penetrating radar scans were repeated in tight grids around the hole, mapping the thickness and density of the surrounding ice. These scans confirmed that while the shaft itself was stable, the rim consisted of layered snow and compacted ice that could shear under sudden load. This meant that any anchoring system would need to be placed well back from the edge, distributing weight across a wider, more reliable area. Depth estimation proved more challenging. Initial laser measurements vanished into darkness long before reaching a solid return. Weighted lines were lowered carefully into the hole, but even these provided inconsistent readings, occasionally swinging or drifting as if encountering open space rather than a straight vertical drop. Acoustic echo tests suggested that the shaft extended far deeper than expected, possibly connecting to a larger chamber beyond the visible walls. Every new measurement reinforced the same conclusion. The descent would not be short, and it would not be simple. The engineer began designing a rope system capable of handling prolonged vertical exposure in extreme cold. Ice screws were placed into solid, ancient layers rather than surface ice, each tested for load-bearing strength. Redundant anchor points were installed to ensure that no single failure could compromise the system. Ropes were selected specifically for polar conditions, treated to resist moisture absorption and stiffening at low temperatures. Even so, the team anticipated that the cold would gradually sap flexibility from the lines, making careful handling essential. Communication posed another concern. Radio signals were unreliable in deep ice formations, often distorted or blocked entirely by dense walls. To mitigate this, the team prepared a tethered communication line alongside the primary rope, allowing for direct audio contact between those descending and those remaining at the surface. Backup systems were prepared as well, including timed signal protocols in case all communication failed. Lighting was treated with equal seriousness. Darkness inside the glacier would be absolute, unbroken by any natural light. Each descending member would carry multiple light sources, including headlamps, chest-mounted lights, and chemical glow markers for redundancy. Batteries were kept insulated until the last possible moment to preserve charge. Even then, the team knew that cold could drain power unpredictably. As technical preparations progressed, attention turned toward environmental and biological considerations. The biologist emphasized that if the source of the strange sounds proved to be a living organism, it would likely be in a state of extreme stress. Sudden exposure to warmer air or human contact could be fatal. For this reason, insulated containment gear was prepared, along with temperature-controlled transport units designed to maintain near-freezing conditions rather than raising the temperature too quickly. Medical supplies were also reviewed and expanded. Hypothermia, frostbite, and exhaustion were expected risks, but the possibility of injury during the descent added urgency to these preparations. The team rehearsed extraction scenarios repeatedly, visualizing how an injured person could be brought back to the surface through the narrow shaft without triggering collapse or further harm. Throughout the day, the strange sounds continued. They rose intermittently from the depths of the hole, carried upward by the steady flow of cold air. Now that the opening was exposed, the sounds were clearer than ever. They were still faint, but they no longer felt distant. Each occurrence reminded the team that time was a factor. Whatever lay below was not static. The signals suggested ongoing activity, and the possibility that a living creature might be trapped within the ice added a quiet urgency to the preparations. By late evening, the team gathered to make the final decision. The analysis was thorough and the risks were undeniable, yet the scientific value of the descent, combined with the ethical responsibility to investigate a potential living source of distress, weighed heavily in favor of proceeding. The team leader authorized the descent under strict conditions. Only a small group would go down initially, minimizing load and complexity. Others would remain at the surface to monitor conditions and manage safety systems. Roles were assigned carefully. 2 researchers would descend together, maintaining visual and physical contact at all times. One would focus on structural observation and navigation, while the other documented the environment and monitored biological indicators. Above them, the engineer and team leader would oversee the rope systems and communication, ready to respond instantly to any sign of instability. Before the descent began, final checks were conducted in silence. Knots were inspected repeatedly. Harnesses were tightened and tested. Instruments were secured against accidental drops. Each person involved understood that once the descent began, There would be no room for improvisation. Every action would need to follow the plan precisely. As the first rope was guided over the edge and tensioned carefully, the glacier seemed to respond. A faint vibration traveled through the ice, barely perceptible but unmistakable. Moments later, the sound rose again from below, slightly stronger than before. It echoed upward through the shaft, carrying with it an unsettling sense of proximity. The team paused, listening. No one spoke, but the shared understanding was clear. The descent was no longer just an exploration of geological structures. It was a direct approach towards the source of the signals, whatever that source might be. The glacier, ancient and inscrutable, had opened a path into its depths, and the expedition was now committed to following it. With the rope secured and the first harness clipped into place, the transition from preparation to action began. The surface world, with its vast horizons and open skies, would soon give way to darkness, ice, and silence. As the first researcher stepped carefully toward the edge of the hole, the expedition crossed an invisible threshold, leaving behind the safety of observation and entering the realm of direct encounter with the unknown hidden beneath Antarctica's frozen surface. The moment the descent began, the world above the glacier seemed to recede with unnatural speed. The edge of the hole framed a circle of pale Antarctic light that shrank steadily as the first researcher lowered themselves into the shaft. The rope slid slowly through gloved hands, its fibers stiff from the cold, every movement deliberate and controlled. Below, the darkness waited in absolute silence, broken only by the faint scrape of equipment against ice. At first, the descent felt deceptively manageable. The upper walls of the shaft were wide and relatively smooth, shaped by long-forgotten processes that had rounded sharp edges and softened irregularities. The ice here was dense and ancient, its surface etched with faint horizontal bands that told the story of snowfall and compression stretching back through centuries. Light from above reflected off these layers, creating a muted glow that followed the descending figures for the first several meters. As they moved deeper, the temperature shifted perceptibly. The cold was no longer the biting, wind-driven chill of the surface, but something heavier and more suffocating. It clung to the body, seeping through layers of insulation and settling into muscles and joints. Breath became more visible, condensing instantly and drifting downward like pale smoke before vanishing into the dark below. Sound behaved differently inside the shaft. Every movement produced an echo that lingered longer than expected, bouncing between the ice walls before dissolving into a low, distant hum. Even the faint creak of the rope seemed amplified, transformed into something larger and more imposing. The glacier no longer felt inert. It felt aware, responsive to intrusion in subtle, unsettling ways. As the descent continued, the researchers' lights revealed increasingly complex structures within the ice. Pockets of trapped air shimmered like frozen constellations, each bubble a fragment of ancient atmosphere sealed away from time. In some sections, the ice grew cloudy and opaque, marbled with fine particles of dust and organic material that hinted at distant volcanic eruptions or long-past environmental shifts. These layers were carefully documented, photographed, and mentally catalogued, even as the team remained acutely aware of their vulnerability suspended in the shaft. Roughly halfway down, the character of the ice began to change. The walls narrowed slightly, and in places they appeared to bulge inward, forming subtle ridges and ledges. Here, the ice showed signs of repeated melting and refreezing, smoothed into curved channels that suggested the flow of water long ago. Thin, elongated ice formations clung to the walls like frozen drips, fragile and sharp, threatening to shatter at the slightest disturbance. The air grew stiller as they descended, the steady upward flow diminishing until it was barely perceptible. With it came a profound silence, so complete that it seemed to press against the senses. In this quiet, the researchers became acutely aware of their own bodies. The rhythm of breathing, the tension in their muscles, the slow burn of cold against exposed skin. Time stretched, measured not in minutes, but in careful movements and controlled breaths. Then, faintly at first, the sound returned. It rose from below as a low, uneven vibration, barely audible yet unmistakable. It was no longer an abstract signal captured by instruments. It was present, immediate, resonating through the ice and into the body. The sound carried an irregular quality, appearing briefly before fading again, as if its source were struggling to produce it. The researchers exchanged a brief glance, their faces hidden behind layers of protective gear, yet their shared focus unmistakable. They slowed their descent, listening carefully as the sound surfaced again, closer now, its direction clearer. It did not echo in the same way as their own movements. It seemed localized, emerging from a specific region below rather than reverberating throughout the shaft. As they continued downward, the shaft opened gradually, the walls pulling back to reveal a wider space. Their lights swept across the ice, illuminating a transition zone where the vertical walls gave way to a sloping descent. The rope slackened slightly as their feet made tentative contact with uneven ground. They had reached the lower section of the shaft. The floor beneath them was a chaotic landscape of ice and frozen debris. Large blocks lay scattered at odd angles, evidence of past collapses from the upper walls. Between them, fine ice dust and compacted snow filled the gaps, forming an unstable surface that shifted subtly underfoot. Every step was tested carefully, weight transferred slowly to avoid triggering further movement. Here, the temperature felt marginally more stable. Still brutally cold, it lacked the sharp fluctuations experienced nearer the surface. The biologist, monitoring environmental readings, noted this with interest. The chamber below appeared insulated from external conditions, its climate shaped more by internal dynamics than by the Antarctic weather above. The sound grew stronger as they advanced. It was no longer merely a vibration, but something closer to a weak, strained call. It emerged in short bursts separated by long pauses, each repetition carrying a sense of exhaustion. The researchers followed it carefully, navigating between ice blocks and along the curved walls of the chamber. As their lights reached further into the space, the true scale of the hidden environment became apparent. The shaft did not terminate at a simple cavity. Instead, it opened into a broad subglacial chamber, its ceiling arching overhead in a smooth, icy curve. The walls bore the same polished appearance seen higher up, confirming that this space had been shaped over immense spans of time. Within the chamber, the signs of past visitors were unmistakable. Along the edges, partially embedded in ice, lay bones and fragments of organic material. Some were small and indistinct, others larger and more recognizable, their shapes preserved with eerie clarity. These remains were scattered unevenly, concentrated in certain areas as if drawn there by unseen forces. The biologist documented each find meticulously, careful not to disturb the surrounding ice. The variety of remains suggested that this chamber had acted as a natural trap for generations of animals. Drawn by thin snow bridges or deceptive surfaces above, they had fallen into the shaft and found no escape. In the extreme cold, their bodies had not decayed in the usual sense. Instead, they had been preserved, slowly becoming part of the glacier's internal record. The source of the sound lay ahead. As the researchers approached, their lights revealed movement. Near the far side of the chamber, partially sheltered by a low ice ridge, a living creature struggled weakly against the frozen ground. Its movements were slow and labored, driven more by instinct than strength. Each attempt to shift position produced a faint sound, the very signal that had carried through the glacier and drawn the expedition to this place. The animal was in a state of severe exhaustion. Its body bore signs of injury, likely sustained during the fall into the chamber. Frost clung to its fur, and its breathing was shallow and uneven. Yet it was alive. Sustained by the stable cold and the absence of predators, its metabolism slowed by the environment itself. The researchers moved with extreme care. Sudden motion or changes in temperature could prove fatal. The biologist signaled for the insulated containment equipment to be prepared. Slowly, methodically, they approached the animal, minimizing noise and disturbance. The creature responded weakly, its movements growing even slower as it expended the last of its energy. Once secured within the insulated unit, the immediate source of the strange sounds fell silent. The chamber seemed to exhale, the echoes fading until only the natural stillness of the ice remained. The rescue, though only a small part of the mission's scope, carried immense weight. It was tangible proof that the signals had not been an illusion or a quirk of glacial mechanics. Life had been calling from beneath the ice. With the animal stabilized as much as possible, attention returned to the chamber itself. As the researchers scanned the area more thoroughly, they noticed something unusual among the remains. Embedded within a thick, clear section of ice near the back wall was a form larger and more defined than the others. Its outline was unmistakable, preserved in extraordinary detail. The shape did not match any modern Antarctic species. Its proportions, the structure of its limbs, and the texture visible beneath the ice suggested something far older. The ice surrounding it was pristine, free of cracks or contamination, as though it had sealed the form away in a single, decisive moment. The realization settled slowly but firmly. This was not merely a chamber of recent casualties, it was a repository, a frozen archive that extended far beyond recorded history. The glacier had not only trapped life within its depths, it had preserved it. As the researchers stood in the silent chamber, lights reflecting off ancient ice and frozen remains, the full significance of the descent began to take shape. What lay before them was not just a scientific anomaly. It was a doorway into the deep past, one that demanded careful, deliberate exploration. Above them, far beyond the reach of their lights, the shaft rose towards the surface world they had left behind. Below and around them, the glacier held its secrets close, revealed only to those willing to descend into its depths. The expedition had crossed a boundary from which there was no simple return. The next steps would determine not only the fate of their discoveries, but the understanding of Antarctica itself. Once the immediate urgency of stabilizing the injured animal had passed, the chamber revealed itself in full. With the faint sounds now gone, replaced by an almost oppressive stillness, the researchers became acutely aware of the space they occupied. The subglacial chamber was far larger than it had first appeared during the descent, its boundaries extending beyond the initial reach of their lights. As they adjusted their equipment and allowed their eyes to acclimate, the true scale of the hidden cavity slowly emerged. The ceiling arched overhead in a smooth, continuous curve, shaped by processes that had acted patiently over immense spans of time. Unlike the chaotic fractures seen near the surface, The ice here bore the marks of long-term stability. The walls were polished and translucent, reflecting the beams of light in soft, diffused patterns that gave the chamber an almost cathedral-like quality. In some places, the ice was so clear that deeper layers were visible within it, creating an illusion of depth that made it difficult to judge distance accurately. The air within the chamber felt different from that of the shaft above. It was colder in absolute terms, yet paradoxically more stable. There were no sudden gusts, no sharp shifts in temperature. The atmosphere seemed insulated from the violence of the Antarctic surface, trapped in a delicate equilibrium that had likely persisted for generations. This stability explained how both living and preserved organisms could exist here, shielded from rapid environmental change. As the researchers advanced cautiously across the uneven floor, they began to document the chamber in detail. The ground was littered with ice blocks of various sizes, some angular and sharp-edged, others smoothed by time. These fragments were the remnants of past collapses, evidence that the chamber had evolved gradually through repeated cycles of stress and release. Between the larger blocks lay layers of compacted snow and ice dust, forming a brittle surface that crunched softly under careful steps. The first clear signs of animal presence appeared near the perimeter of the chamber. Along the gently sloping walls, faint impressions were visible in the ice where bodies had once rested. Some were little more than shadows, darker outlines preserved by subtle differences in density and trapped air. Others were far more distinct, revealing skeletal structures frozen in place, their positions unchanged since the moment of death. The biologist moved slowly among these remains, documenting each one with meticulous care. There was an unsettling diversity among them. Some belonged to modern Antarctic species, identifiable by their size and structure. Others were harder to place, their forms suggesting animals that no longer inhabited the region or perhaps no longer existed at all. The preservation varied, indicating that the chamber had been claiming victims over an extended period rather than during a single catastrophic event. Patterns began to emerge as the remains were mapped. They were not distributed randomly. Instead, many were clustered along a gentle curve near one side of the chamber, as if drawn there by subtle forces. The glaciologists theorized that slight air currents or historical water flow beneath the ice could have guided bodies toward this area over time. This accumulation zone, as it came to be understood, offered crucial insight into the chamber's internal dynamics. The mechanism that had turned the chamber into a natural trap was disturbingly simple. Above, the glacier's surface bore thin snow bridges and deceptively stable-looking crust that could support weight only briefly. Animals wandering across the ice, whether driven by curiosity, migration, or pursuit of food, would have encountered these weak points and fallen through without warning. Once inside the shaft, escape was impossible. The walls were too smooth and steep, and the cold quickly drained strength and awareness. The injured animal rescued earlier now took on new significance in this context. It was not an anomaly, but the latest in a long line of victims. The faint sounds that had drawn the expedition here were echoes of a process that had been repeating quietly for centuries, unnoticed beneath the frozen surface. As the team continued their exploration, attention was drawn to deeper recesses of the chamber. In one direction, the wall curved inward, forming a broad alcove partially shielded from the rest of the space. The ice there appeared darker and denser, its surface uninterrupted by the fractures seen elsewhere. As lights swept across it, something within the ice caught their attention. Embedded deep within this section was a shape that did not resemble the scattered remains surrounding it. It was larger, more complete, and far more sharply defined. The ice around it was extraordinarily clear, as though it had frozen in a single, uninterrupted event. The outline was unmistakable, revealing limbs, torso, and features preserved in astonishing detail. The researchers approached with caution, their movements slow and deliberate. The form within the ice was unlike any modern Antarctic animal. Its proportions suggested a species adapted to a very different environment, one that may have existed long before the current ice sheet reached its present extent. The realization unfolded gradually, as each observer took in the same details from their own perspective. This was not a recent casualty, it was ancient. The glaciologists examined the surrounding ice layers, tracing their continuity and thickness. The strata enveloping the preserved body were undisturbed, indicating that the organism had been sealed away at the moment of freezing and remained untouched ever since. There were no cracks, no signs of melting or refreezing that might have compromised its integrity. The preservation was nearly perfect, a rare convergence of environmental conditions that had effectively halted time. The biologist noted the absence of scavenging marks or decay. In this environment, bacteria and decomposers were virtually non-existent. The cold, combined with the lack of oxygen, had created a natural preservation chamber more effective than any artificial method. Even delicate structures appeared intact, offering the possibility of studying tissues, skin, and perhaps even genetic material. As the team documented the find, the implications became increasingly profound. The organism represented a snapshot of life from a period when Antarctica's climate, geography, and ecosystems were fundamentally different. Its presence here suggested that the continent had once supported a much richer biological landscape, one that had been gradually erased by advancing ice. The discovery also raised questions about the chamber itself. How had such a large organism come to rest in this exact location? The glaciologists proposed that the chamber had once been connected to subglacial waterways, channels that flowed beneath the ice during warmer climatic phases. These hidden rivers could have transported bodies and sediment into the chamber before freezing solid. Over time, the glacier above thickened, sealing the system and preserving everything within. This hypothesis was supported by subtle features in the ice walls, faint grooves and channels that hinted at ancient water movement. These traces were faint but unmistakable to trained eyes. They painted a picture of a dynamic subglacial environment that had long since vanished, leaving behind only frozen echoes of its activity. The researchers also noted the presence of microscopic inclusions within the ice near the preserved organism. Fine particles, possibly organic in origin, were suspended in layers around the body. These could represent remnants of ancient ecosystems, microscopic life forms, or environmental debris that had settled alongside the organism at the time of freezing. Such inclusions held the potential to reveal unprecedented details about past climate and biological conditions. As documentation continued, the team became acutely aware of the responsibility that came with such a discovery. The chamber was not merely a place of scientific interest. It was a fragile archive, its contents preserved by a delicate balance of temperature and isolation. Any disturbance carried the risk of irreversible damage. The decision was made to limit physical interaction to the absolute minimum. No attempts were made to extract samples from the ice at this stage. Instead, the focus remained on comprehensive documentation. High-resolution imaging, three-dimensional scans, and detailed environmental measurements were collected to capture as much information as possible without altering the chamber's conditions. Throughout this process, the memory of the rescued animal lingered in the background. Its presence had been a reminder that the chamber was not entirely a relic of the past. It remained part of an active, evolving system that could still affect living creatures. The signals that had drawn the expedition here were not merely echoes of ancient processes, but warnings of ongoing hazards hidden beneath the ice. As time passed, the researchers felt the weight of isolation more heavily than ever. Enclosed within the glacier, surrounded by ancient ice and frozen remains, they were acutely aware of how small and temporary their presence was. The chamber had existed long before them and would likely persist long after they were gone, silently preserving its secrets beneath kilometers of ice. Eventually, practical considerations forced a pause in exploration. Air supply, energy reserves, and physical endurance imposed limits that could not be ignored. The team gathered once more near the center of the chamber, taking a final, comprehensive sweep with their lights. Every detail was committed to memory and record, knowing that this might be their only chance to observe the chamber in its undisturbed state. As preparations were made to ascend back toward the surface, the significance of what they had found began to settle fully. The subglacial chamber was not an isolated anomaly. It was evidence of a hidden world beneath Antarctica's ice, a world shaped by ancient climates and preserved by relentless cold. The preserved organism in particular represented a discovery that could reshape understanding of the continent's biological history. With the rescued animal secured and the documentation complete, the team turned their attention upward. The ascent would carry them back toward light, wind, and the familiar dangers of the surface, but they would not return unchanged. The glacier had revealed a fragment of its memory, and with it, a responsibility that extended far beyond the scope of the original mission. As the rope tightened and the first researcher began the long climb back through the shaft, the chamber receded into darkness once more. Yet its presence lingered, etched into the minds of those who had seen it. The glacier had not only spoken through strange sounds, it had shown them a preserved chapter of Earth's past, sealed in ice, waiting to be understood. The ascent from the subglacial chamber was slow and physically demanding, yet mentally the team was already far from the icy shaft. As they climbed back toward the surface, the images of what they had seen below replayed relentlessly in their minds. The rescued animal, now stabilized and carefully insulated, was only one part of the story. The true weight of the expedition lay in what remained, frozen in the depths of the glacier, sealed within crystal-clear ice like a message from a vanished world. When the researchers finally emerged into the pale Antarctic light, the surface felt strangely unreal. The vast horizon, the wind-scoured snow, and the familiar hum of equipment all seemed distant compared to the silent chamber below. Yet there was no time to linger on reflection. The moment the descent team was secured and warmed, the focus shifted to documentation, analysis, and the preservation of what had been found. Inside the shelter, instruments were activated, data streams reviewed, and preliminary interpretations cautiously formed. The preserved organism discovered in the chamber dominated every discussion, not through speculation but through its undeniable physical reality. High-resolution images displayed on monitors revealed details that had been impossible to fully appreciate in the dim light below. Limbs, musculature, and surface textures were visible beneath the ice with astonishing clarity. The organism was complete, undistorted, and untouched by decay. From the first careful examination, it was evident that this was not a modern species. Its anatomy differed in subtle yet unmistakable ways from any known Antarctic animal. Proportions suggested adaptations to an environment that no longer existed on the continent, possibly one shaped by open water and milder temperatures. The body was compact yet powerful, built for movement in conditions very different from the frozen desert above. The glaciologists worked methodically to estimate the age of the ice surrounding the organism. By tracing visible layers and correlating them with known climatic markers such as volcanic ash deposits and atmospheric composition trapped in air bubbles, they arrived at a preliminary conclusion that left the room silent. The ice encasing the organism dated back tens of thousands of years, to a period when Antarctica's climate was in transition and vast changes reshaped its ecosystems. This realization elevated the discovery beyond rarity. Perfectly preserved organisms from such deep time were almost unheard of, particularly in environments where extraction often destroyed fragile structures. Here, nature itself had acted as a meticulous archivist. The freezing process had been rapid and complete, halting biological processes almost instantly. The absence of oxygen and microbial activity had done the rest, preserving tissues, surface features, and potentially even genetic material in a state close to their original form. The biologist, reviewing the images and environmental data, noted that the preservation conditions rivaled or surpassed those of permafrost sites elsewhere in the world. Unlike permafrost, which often underwent repeated freeze-thaw cycles, the subglacial chamber appeared to have remained consistently cold and sealed. This stability suggested that the organism had been frozen once and never disturbed again, a scenario ideal for long-term preservation. As analysis continued, attention turned to the ice itself. Surrounding the preserved body were microscopic inclusions suspended within specific layers. These particles were not random. Preliminary optical analysis indicated organic material, possibly remnants of microorganisms or environmental debris present at the time of freezing. Their distribution formed subtle halos around the organism, as if the surrounding environment had been captured alongside it. This raised the possibility that the chamber did not merely preserve isolated specimens, but entire snapshots of ancient ecosystems at a microscopic level. If confirmed, this would provide an unprecedented opportunity to study not only extinct organisms, but the environments in which they lived. Climate conditions, biological interactions, and even seasonal patterns might be reconstructed from the frozen evidence. The implications rippled outward rapidly. The team recognized that the discovery challenged existing assumptions about Antarctica's biological history. Conventional models depicted the continent as largely inhospitable for millions of years, with only limited coastal ecosystems surviving as the ice advanced. The presence of such a well-preserved organism deep within the ice suggested a far more complex narrative, one involving periods of relative warmth, dynamic subglacial environments, and possibly extensive habitats that had since been erased. Communication with the broader scientific community began cautiously. Preliminary reports were transmitted to coordinating institutions accompanied by select datasets and imagery. The language used was deliberately restrained, focused on verified observations rather than interpretation. Even so, the response was immediate. Requests for additional information arrived within hours, followed by offers of support from experts in paleobiology, genomics, and glacial geology. The team understood the importance of maintaining scientific rigor. Extraordinary discoveries often attracted premature conclusions, and the risk of misinterpretation was significant. For this reason, they established strict protocols for further study. No attempt would be made to extract the preserved organism on site. The risk of thermal shock or structural damage was too great, Instead, plans were drafted to transport the entire ice section under controlled conditions to a specialized facility equipped to handle such fragile material. This decision marked a turning point. The expedition was no longer a localized investigation, but the first phase of a much larger scientific effort. International collaboration would be required, along with careful logistical planning and ethical oversight. The preserved organism was not simply a specimen. It was a shared heritage of scientific knowledge, one that demanded responsible stewardship. Beyond the immediate discovery, the team began to consider the broader context. The subglacial chamber itself represented a new class of natural feature. If such chambers existed beneath one glacier, they could exist beneath many others. The acoustic signals that led to this find might not be unique but part of a wider phenomenon, detectable through careful monitoring. Antarctica's ice sheet, long studied from above and through drilling, now appeared to conceal vast internal landscapes that had gone largely unnoticed. This realization reframed the expedition's original goals. What began as an assessment of structural stability had uncovered an entirely new dimension of Antarctic science. The glacier was no longer viewed solely as a mass of ice responding to climate forces. It was a complex system, capable of preserving biological and environmental records across immense spans of time. As the days passed, the team worked tirelessly to consolidate their findings. Every piece of data was reviewed, cross-referenced, and archived. The rescued animal, now safely transported to a controlled environment on the surface, became a living reminder of the chamber's ongoing relevance. Its survival underscored the fact that the glacier was not merely a relic of the past, but an active participant in the present ecosystem, capable of affecting life in unexpected ways. Quiet moments of reflection inevitably followed. Standing near the edge of the hole, now carefully marked and secured, the researchers looked out across the endless white expanse with a changed perspective. Beneath that seemingly uniform surface lay hidden worlds, shaped by ancient climates and preserved by relentless cold. The ice was not empty. It was full of stories. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on the expedition leader. Decisions made here would influence not only scientific understanding, but future exploration policies. Protecting such sites from contamination, exploitation, or careless interference would be essential. Antarctica was governed by international agreements designed to preserve its pristine nature, and discoveries like this tested the boundaries of those frameworks. As preparations began for the next phase of the mission, one truth became undeniable. The preserved organism was not an isolated miracle. It was evidence of a vast, largely unexplored archive beneath the ice, waiting to be uncovered. The expedition had opened a door, but what lay beyond it was far greater than any single team or mission. The glacier, silent once more, held its secrets close. Yet it had revealed enough to change the course of Antarctic research forever. What remained was to decide how humanity would proceed, armed with new knowledge and confronted by the immense responsibility that came with uncovering the deep, frozen memory of the planet. The final phase of the expedition unfolded not with the drama of discovery, but with the weight of consequence. What had been revealed beneath the glacier could not be unseen, and it could not be treated as an isolated curiosity. As the team transitioned from exploration to preservation, every action was governed by the understanding that the true impact of their work would be measured not by what they found, but by how they chose to protect and interpret it. The first priority was extraction without disturbance. The rescued animal was transferred with painstaking care, its temperature stabilized within a narrow margin designed to mirror the subglacial chamber rather than the comparatively warmer surface. It was moved in stages, each transition monitored to prevent shock. The process took far longer than expected, but caution prevailed over speed. When the animal was finally secured within a controlled enclosure at the surface camp, it became a living symbol of the expedition's ethical responsibility. The Glacier had taken life silently for centuries, and for the first time, one of its victims had been returned. Parallel to this effort, the documentation of the chamber and its preserved contents was completed with obsessive precision. Every coordinate, every temperature reading, every acoustic resonance was logged and cross-referenced. The team constructed a comprehensive three-dimensional model of the shaft and chamber using combined data from scans, photographs, and sensor readings. This virtual reconstruction allowed scientists to revisit the space without physically entering it again, minimizing further risk to both people and the fragile environment below. The opening itself was not left exposed. After careful deliberation, the team reinforced the perimeter and marked it with clear indicators visible even in low-contrast Antarctic light. The goal was not to conceal the site but to prevent accidental intrusion. Future access would require authorization, specialized equipment, and strict adherence to newly drafted protocols. The Glacier had revealed a vulnerability, and it was now humanity's responsibility to ensure that curiosity did not become recklessness. Once the immediate fieldwork concluded, communication with the wider scientific community intensified. Preliminary findings were shared through secure channels, accompanied by raw data rather than conclusions. The response was swift and unprecedented. Researchers from multiple disciplines recognized the significance of what had been uncovered. Paleobiologists saw the potential to reconstruct extinct ecosystems with unparalleled accuracy. Climate scientists recognized a new source of long-term environmental records. Glaciologists began to reconsider assumptions about the internal complexity of Antarctic ice. What emerged was not a single narrative, but a convergence of questions. How many such chambers existed beneath the ice? Were they rare anomalies or common features hidden by the limitations of existing survey methods? Could acoustic monitoring become a primary tool for detecting subglacial voids and archives? Each question generated others, branching outward into possibilities that extended far beyond the scope of the original mission. The preserved organism became the focal point of this expanding inquiry. Transporting it safely required international coordination and the development of custom containment systems capable of maintaining stable conditions over vast distances. Specialized laboratories prepared to receive it, not as a specimen to be dissected hastily, but as a fragile record of deep time. Plans were made for non-invasive imaging, gradual analysis, and long-term study that could span decades. As these preparations unfolded, the team reflected on the broader implications of their discovery. Antarctica, long perceived as a static wasteland of ice, now appeared in a new light. Beneath its frozen surface lay evidence of movement, change, and life shaped by climates far removed from the present. The ice was not merely a barrier, but a medium, capable of preserving the planet's history with extraordinary fidelity. This realization challenged deeply held assumptions. It suggested that the continent's transformation into its current state had been neither uniform nor simple. Instead, Antarctica's past was marked by transitions, hidden waterways, and ecosystems that thrived briefly before being sealed away. The glacier they had studied was not an exception, but a witness, carrying within it traces of worlds that no longer existed. At the same time, the discovery underscored the dangers hidden beneath the ice. The chamber was a natural trap, one that continued to claim victims long after the conditions that created it had vanished. This raised urgent questions about safety, not only for wildlife but for future human activity in Antarctica. As research and exploration expanded, understanding and mapping such hazards became essential. The team's experience also reshaped their view of scientific responsibility. They had not set out to make a landmark discovery, yet circumstance and persistence had placed one in their care. With that came the obligation to resist sensationalism, to prioritize preservation over recognition, and to ensure that the site remained protected under international agreements governing Antarctic research. In the weeks that followed, as data analysis continued and planning for future missions began, one final detail continued to draw attention. The acoustic monitoring equipment left in place near the glacier recorded ongoing signals, subtle and intermittent, similar to those that had initiated the expedition's descent. Further analysis suggested that these were not echoes from the known chamber alone. Reflections and variations hinted at additional voids deeper within the ice, possibly part of a broader network yet to be explored. This revelation did not prompt immediate action. Instead, it reinforced the need for patience and preparation. The glacier had revealed one of its secrets, but it was clear that many more remained. Understanding them would require new methods, long-term observation, and a willingness to approach the unknown with humility. As the expedition prepared to depart, the team gathered one last time near the marked opening. The wind swept across the ice as it always had, indifferent to human presence. Beneath their feet, the chamber lay silent once more, its contents preserved in darkness. The glacier had returned to stillness, but it was no longer perceived as empty. In leaving, the researchers carried with them more than data and samples. They carried a revised understanding of Antarctica as a living archive, a place where the past was not erased but carefully stored, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The expedition had begun with questions about ice stability and structural risk. It ended with a profound insight into the planet's capacity to remember. The consequences of that insight would unfold over years, shaping future research, informing policy, and deepening humanity's appreciation of the fragile systems hidden beneath the world's most extreme environments. Antarctica remained vast, cold, and remote, but it was no longer silent. Those who listened closely now knew that beneath the ice, history endured, preserved with patience beyond human measure. If this discovery shocked you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what we uncover next. More hidden places, real expeditions, and discoveries the world was never meant to see are already waiting for you in our other videos. Watch the next story now, and if this video surprised you, share it with someone who loves mysteries buried beneath the surface.